High over northern France on April 8, 1943, the altitude registered 27,000 feet, and the air was thin enough to make breathing a conscious effort, even through rubber and metal. Oberleutnant Ralph Hermchen settled into his Focke-Wulf 190A5 cockpit with the confidence of a man who had watched others die and survived long enough to expect he might see tomorrow. Below him, struggling upward in formation, 16 ungainly shapes labored against gravity and their own mass. The American fighters, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts making their first combat appearance over occupied Europe, looked to Hermchen like an engineering mistake wrapped in olive-drab paint, and he said so over the radio, describing them as bottles trying to pretend they were bullets. The laughter that followed his transmission was easy, casual, the kind of contempt veterans reserve for newcomers who clearly don't understand the rules. Those 16 Thunderbolts belonged to the 4th Fighter Group, and each one carried roughly 13,000 pounds into the fight when fully loaded, a staggering figure for a single-seat aircraft in 1943, driven by Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines that generated 2,000 horsepower and still seemed barely adequate for the task. To pilots trained on Spitfires or Messerschmitts, the proportions looked fundamentally wrong. Fuselages shaped like barrels, canopies that bulged upward, wings that appeared too modest for the bodies they supported, and propellers so large they seemed borrowed from a different class of machine entirely. German pilots had grown accustomed to facing Soviet fighters built for maneuverability and British designs optimized for elegance. So when they saw the American entry into the fighter war, the visual impression suggested either ignorance or desperation. What none of them understood, not Hermchen, not his wingman, not the experienced killers circling above, was that they were witnessing the arrival of a weapon system designed around principles Germany had not prepared to counter, and that within 18 months those same bottles would become the most feared sound in their sky. Inside the broad wings of each Thunderbolt sat 8 Browning M2 machine guns, 50 caliber weapons synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, fed by ammunition belts carrying 425 rounds per gun, 3,400 rounds total, nearly 900 pounds of projectiles waiting to be converted into kinetic violence at roughly 2,900 feet per second. The combined rate of fire approached 100 rounds per second when all 8 guns spoke together, creating a stream of half-inch projectiles dense enough to destroy structure, ignite fuel, and dismember aircraft in a convergence zone measured in feet rather than yards. That destructive mathematics was already loaded and armed, waiting only for American pilots to learn how to use it. But on April 8, 1943, the learning had barely begun. Major Donald Blakesley, leading the 335th Fighter Squadron, had transferred from the RAF Eagle squadrons only weeks earlier, and he carried with him the hard-won knowledge that European air combat rewarded speed and altitude more than turning radius. Yet even he did not fully understand what the massive aircraft beneath him was truly built to accomplish. The Thunderbolt was not an accident or a compromise. It was the answer to a question asked in panic during June 1940, when German fighters were sweeping across France and the United States Army Air Forces realized they had nothing capable of meeting the Luftwaffe at high altitude. Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, received specifications that called for a high-altitude interceptor, and he responded by designing something so large and heavy that even his own engineering team questioned whether it would leave the ground. He reportedly described it as a dinosaur, acknowledging the mass and bulk but insisting that if the proportions were correct, the animal would move. The XP-47B prototype that lifted off on May 6, 1941, weighed 9,900 pounds empty, roughly 65% heavier than the P-43 Lancer it replaced, and featured a turbo supercharger system so complex that its ducting ran through the entire rear fuselage, giving the aircraft a profile that looked swollen, almost gravid, as if carrying something inside it that didn't quite fit. Test pilots approaching the machine for the first time kept asking variations of the same question. Does this thing actually fly, or are we testing a static display? It flew, and at altitude it flew in ways that made conventional fighters seem fragile and starved. The R-2800 engine, an 18-cylinder radial producing power that could be sustained all the way up to 27,000 feet, drew its strength from an exhaust-driven turbo supercharger that delivered near sea-level performance in the stratosphere, where air density dropped and conventional superchargers began to labor. The result was an aircraft that grew stronger as it climbed, exactly where German fighters began to weaken, inverting the altitude advantage that Luftwaffe pilots had learned to exploit against earlier Allied types. But in early training, the Thunderbolt killed Americans faster than it would kill Germans for months afterward. Major Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group at Bridgeport, Connecticut, watched his unit lose 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in accidents between September 1942 and January 1943, a casualty rate that made some observers wonder whether the airplane was fundamentally flawed. It ground-looped during landing if you let the tail come down too fast. It torque-rolled on takeoff if you added power without compensating with rudder. And in a dive, it accelerated so aggressively that pilots encountered compressibility effects, their controls stiffening as shock waves formed across the wings, and the aircraft approached speeds where the air itself began to behave differently. Yet the pilots who survived the learning curve discovered something unexpected. The Thunderbolt forgave mistakes that would kill you in lighter aircraft, because underneath the ungainly exterior was a structure built to absorb punishment. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would eventually be credited with 27 victories, described his first flight as feeling like you'd been strapped to a locomotive and told to aim it. The power didn't feel like something you controlled so much as something you directed, a force already in motion that you could point but never truly tame. The first combat encounters in April and May 1943 seemed to confirm every prejudice the Germans held. P-47s could not turn inside Focke-Wulf 190s. They could not climb with Messerschmitt Bf-109s at medium altitude. They could not match the nimble handling that German pilots had learned to exploit in vertical scissors and rolling engagements. Luftwaffe units quickly developed tactics to force Thunderbolts into exactly those disadvantages, attacking from below where the heavy American fighters struggled to maneuver, dragging them into turning fights where agility mattered more than firepower, exploiting every moment when the P-47 had to trade energy for position. Hauptmann Josef Pips Priller, commanding JG-26, filed a report after his first encounter that dripped with contempt, describing the new American fighter as target practice, a machine that flew like a truck, turned like a locomotive, and climbed like something overweight and ungraceful. The statistics from the first month of operations appeared to support his assessment. American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed German kills, an exchange rate that suggested the aircraft was fundamentally outclassed. Even the RAF, observing from their Spitfire squadrons, began quietly suggesting that the Americans might want to reconsider their choice, and British pilots joked that the best defensive maneuver in a Thunderbolt was to unbuckle and run laps inside the spacious cockpit until the enemy ran out of ammunition. But beneath the surface of those early defeats, something strange was happening that German intelligence failed to fully register. The P-47s that went down had absorbed levels of damage that would have disintegrated any other fighter in service. One aircraft returned from a May 4th mission carrying 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes, damage that should have reduced a Messerschmitt or Spitfire to fragments falling separately toward the ground. Yet the Thunderbolt landed, taxied, and could be repaired. The massive radial engine, lacking the vulnerable liquid cooling system that turned a single glycol leak into a death sentence, shrugged off hits that would have stopped inline engines instantly, and when P-47s managed to get their guns aligned on target, the results were not shoot-downs in the traditional sense, but something closer to structural disassembly in mid-air. The weapons battery created a cone of destruction that German pilots had never experienced, because unlike the rifle-caliber guns of early warfighters or the heavy cannon that carried limited ammunition, the American .50 calibers could sustain fire for more than 30 seconds, an eternity in combat, long enough to correct aim, walk rounds onto target, and keep firing until something fundamental gave way. The incident that would begin shifting German perception occurred on June 26, 1943, over France, and it involved Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron, in an encounter that became legendary on both sides precisely because it should not have been survivable. Johnson's formation of 48 Thunderbolts was returning from escort duty when 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from JG-26, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of Adolf Galland, executed a perfect bounce, diving out of the sun with overwhelming speed advantage and catching the Americans in exactly the kind of ambush that typically ended fights before they began. Johnson, flying tail-end position, found himself in the crossfire of multiple attackers within the first seconds, and his aircraft took catastrophic damage almost immediately. 20mm cannon shells detonated across the fuselage. The canopy shattered into fragments. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit interior. The engine cowling tore away, and fire erupted somewhere behind the instrument panel where he couldn't see it but could feel the heat. Wounded in the face and leg by metal fragments, Johnson tried to bail out and discovered the canopy track had been destroyed by a shell impact, welding the mechanism shut and trapping him inside a dying machine at 27,000 feet, with no forward visibility and controls that responded only intermittently. What happened next violated every assumption about damage tolerance. Despite an oil-covered windscreen that turned the world into brown smears, despite an engine shaking itself towards self-destruction, despite control surfaces that barely responded and a fire he couldn't extinguish, Johnson managed to level the aircraft and point it toward England, flying by feel and memory and whatever limited instruments still functioned. The P-47 kept flying with damage that should have reduced it to debris, and then the situation deteriorated further when a lone FW-190, flown by a pilot whose identity was never definitively established, though German combat reports from that day offer several possibilities, found the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the channel at less than 170 miles per hour. The German pilot positioned himself behind Johnson's aircraft and opened fire with 4 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns, pouring everything he had into a target that could neither evade nor return fire. Johnson could only crouch behind his armor plate and wait for the end, listening to impacts that sounded like sledgehammers hitting metal, feeling the aircraft shudder with each strike, and somehow, impossibly, still flying. The German exhausted his cannon ammunition, repositioned, and fired again with machine guns alone, determined to finish what should already be finished, yet the Thunderbolt refused to come apart. The FW-190 pilot pulled alongside to confirm the kill, and found himself staring at a flying wreck that had no right to exist. Johnson could see his face clearly through the shattered canopy. Young, blonde, an expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching fear, and the German shook his head, perhaps in disbelief, perhaps in respect, gave what looked like an informal salute, and broke away, out of ammunition, and apparently out of explanations for what he was witnessing. Johnson's P-47 made it to Manston with the engine dying on the runway, and the crew chief eventually stopped counting bullet holes after reaching 200. One cannon shell had detonated inches from Johnson's head. Another had struck the armor plate directly behind his seat. The engine had taken direct hits. Control cables were partially severed, and 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone running the length of the fuselage, were shot through. Yet the aircraft had brought him home because it was built to a standard of ruggedness that no one, including its designers, had fully understood until combat tested it to destruction, and the survival of Johnson's aircraft sent shockwaves through both air forces, because it forced a re-evaluation of assumptions. American engineers studying the wreckage realized they had built something tougher than they intended. German intelligence receiving combat reports from JG-26 initially refused to believe them, insisting that no aircraft could absorb that volume of fire and survive, until testimony from multiple pilots confirmed the impossible. By July 1943, American pilots were beginning to learn how to exploit the Thunderbolt's actual strengths rather than fight against its limitations, and the transformation came from brutal trial and error. Hub Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, distilled the lesson into simple rules. Don't turn with them. Don't try to climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. The massive weight that seemed like a handicap became a weapon once pilots understood that in a dive, nothing could catch a Thunderbolt. From 30,000 feet, the aircraft could reach 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could achieve even in a vertical plunge, and that speed could be converted back into altitude through a zoom climb that left pursuers helplessly behind, unable to follow without bleeding energy they didn't have. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, who would become one of the first American aces in Europe, developed what became known as boom and zoom tactics, though pilots called it other things depending on their mood. Some called it the turkey shoot. Others simply called it murder from above, because the technique turned dogfighting into a form of execution. Instead of engaging in traditional turning combat, P-47 formations climbed to 30,000 feet or higher, altitudes where German fighters could operate but not effectively, and when Luftwaffe aircraft appeared below, the Thunderbolts rolled inverted and dove, building speed until deflection shooting became nearly impossible for defenders who had only seconds to react before the attack passed through their formation. At the bottom of those dives, 8 heavy machine guns spoke together, and German pilots who survived described it as encountering a solid barrier of projectiles, a wall you couldn't dodge once you entered its radius. Aircraft caught in the convergence zone didn't fall gracefully. They came apart, wings separating, tails shearing off, fuselages opening along seams that were never meant to experience that kind of stress. The full revelation of American firepower arrived during the August 17, 1943, dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the deepest penetration into German territory attempted up to that date, a mission designed to test whether heavy bombers could strike industrial targets without fighter escort for the entire route. The mission exposed the P-47's fundamental limitation. Range, even with external drop tanks, could not yet cover the distance required. But it also demonstrated what happened when Thunderbolts were employed correctly at altitude with proper tactics. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, encountered a formation of Messerschmitt Bf-110 destroyers positioning to attack B-17 bombers with their heavy cannon and rocket armament. The twin-engine German fighters were specialized bomber killers, heavily armed but less maneuverable, exactly the kind of target the P-47 was built to destroy. Schilling's flight of 4 Thunderbolts rolled into their attack from 28,000 feet, and Unteroffizier Hinrich Roth, a gunner in one of the Bf-110s who survived, later recounted the experience during interrogation. "The American fighters came down like hammers dropped from heaven," he said, and he opened fire at 800 meters, saw his rounds strike the leader's wing, watched the P-47 absorb the impacts without even wobbling, and then the American fired back. The aircraft ahead of Roth's position simply disintegrated, not shot down in the sense of losing control and spiraling toward Earth, but destroyed in the sense of ceasing to exist as a coherent structure, wings tearing away from the fuselage, tail severing, the crew compartment shredded into metal fragments so small they fluttered rather than fell. In 2 seconds, a Bf-110 became nothing, and within a minute, the formation had lost multiple aircraft to the same concentrated violence. German pilots had never experienced firepower packed this densely into a single fighter. Each P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun, 3,400 rounds total, weighing nearly 900 pounds, and at convergence distance, typically set around 300 yards, all 8 ballistic paths intersected in a zone roughly 6 feet in diameter, meaning anything that entered that space faced approximately 100 projectiles per second, each traveling at 2,900 feet per second, each carrying enough energy to punch through aluminum, steel, flesh, and bone without meaningful deceleration. The ammunition itself was a revelation of American industrial capacity, because while German fighters struggled with limited cannon loads, typically 120 to 200 rounds for a 20mm weapon, forcing pilots to be selective and precise, American pilots could hold the trigger for over half a minute if necessary, mixing armor-piercing incendiary, tracer, and ball rounds in patterns designed to both destroy structure and ignite fuel. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, who would eventually be credited with 28 victories to become one of the top American aces in Europe, described the effect with brutal simplicity. When you hit them with all 8 guns, they don't just go down, they explode. He saw a Bf-109 literally severed in half, the tail section tumbling one direction while the nose and wings continued another, the pilot never given time to understand what had struck him before consciousness ended. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was discovering another reality about the P-47 that made high-altitude interception increasingly suicidal. Its performance improved dramatically with altitude precisely where German fighters began to suffer, because the turbo-supercharged Double Wasp maintained rated power output all the way up to 30,000 feet, while German fighters relying on single-stage or two-stage mechanical superchargers saw performance degrade significantly above 25,000 feet, turning what Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful aces with 206 victories accumulated across multiple fronts, encountered this reality fatally on October 8, 1943, while leading an interception against B-17 formations at 28,000 feet over northern France. His FW-190A6 felt sluggish and unresponsive in the thin air, the BMW 801 engine gasping for oxygen nearly 6 miles above the earth. And when P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group dove on his formation from 32,000 feet, the German A-7 fighters were trapped in slow motion, unable to maneuver effectively or build the speed necessary to escape. Robert Johnson, now an experienced combat pilot climbing toward ace status, was flying at 31,000 feet when he spotted Phillips' distinctive Focke-Wulf with its elaborate nose art, and his combat report was clinical in its brevity. Opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection, observed strikes along entire fuselage, enemy aircraft exploded, no parachute observed. Phillips' death sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe, not because he was the first ace to fall, aces had been dying since the war began, but because this was a man who had survived over 500 combat missions on both Eastern and Western fronts, a pilot who understood energy management and deflection shooting and survival better than most instructors, and if he could be swatted from the sky like a novice, what chance did average pilots have once Thunderbolts owned the upper altitudes? German High Command ordered an immediate assessment of the P-47's capabilities, and the report delivered to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in November 1943 was sobering in its conclusions. Service ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, higher than any German fighter could reach. Dive speed approached terminal velocity. Armor included 3/8-inch steel plate behind the pilot, half-inch bulletproof glass ahead, and armored deflection plates around the engine and oil cooler. Most disturbing of all, its A construction allowed it to absorb damage that would destroy 3 conventional fighters and still return home, turning attrition into a mathematics problem Germany could not solve. In January 1944, a new variant of the P-47 began arriving in England that completed the transformation from object of mockery into instrument of systematic destruction. The P-47D-22 featured a Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller with paddle blades, broad core designs roughly 13 feet in diameter that bit into the air like massive oars, and the improvement in climb rate was immediate and dramatic. Where earlier Thunderbolts had climbed at roughly 2,200 feet per minute at sea level, a figure Germans mocked as inadequate, the paddle blade variants could achieve 3,000 feet per minute, suddenly matching or exceeding German fighters across most of the altitude. The massive propeller also improved acceleration, allowing P-47s to build energy faster in level flight, exactly what boom and zoom tactics demanded. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke of JG-11, a veteran with over 200 combat missions, encountered the new variants in February 1944 during a bomber interception near Hanover, and he wrote in his combat diary that the fat American fighters had learned to climb. They bounced to formation expecting the usual advantage, but the Thunderbolts turned into them and climbed alongside them, and when the Germans tried to disengage, the P-47s followed them up to 30,000 feet where one pilot was caught and blown. Apart, nothing remaining but smoke and fragments, and Knoke concluded his entry by noting these were not the same machines they had laughed at a year earlier. The paddle blade propeller did more than improve performance. It changed the sound of the Thunderbolt because the blade tips approached supersonic speeds during operation, creating a distinctive thundering roar that could be heard from miles away, a deep, threatening rumble that German ground troops learned to identify by audio signature alone, describing it as approaching weather, a storm you could hear long before you could see it. By March 1944, P-47s equipped with external fuel tanks, typically two 108-gallon wing tanks or a single 75-gallon belly tank, could escort bombers deep into Germany, extending range beyond 1,000 miles, and with the paddle blade propeller providing improved performance even when loaded, Thunderbolts could fight effectively immediately after dropping tanks, rather than feeling sluggish and compromised. The Luftwaffe's response was to concentrate on the bombers themselves, hoping to inflict enough losses to stop the American daylight campaign through sheer attrition. But this strategy required flying through the P-47 escort screen, an increasingly suicidal proposition as American pilots accumulated experience and German pilots entered combat with less training than their predecessors had received. Major Gunther Roll, one of Germany's top aces with 275 victories mostly accumulated on the Eastern Front, survived an encounter with P-47s on March 6, 1944, that left him badly wounded. And he later recalled in a post-war interview that they saw the Thunderbolts above them, fat silhouettes against the sun, and someone laughed and made a joke about flying pigs, but nobody was laughing 30 seconds later, when the Americans came down like an avalanche, faster than reaction time, destroying 3 fighters in the first pass, just gone, transformed into burning debris that used to be aircraft and pilots and futures. Rahl described their guns not as firing in bursts like German weapons, but pouring out solid streams of projectiles. And he said getting caught in that stream meant instant death with no time to correct or evade or do anything except cease to exist. The escort missions revealed another P-47 advantage that Germany could not counter: endurance. Because while Luftwaffe fighters operated at maximum power settings that consumed fuel rapidly, the big American radials could cruise efficiently at high altitude, allowing Thunderbolts to remain with bomber formations for hours, rotating top cover while maintaining enough reserves for combat and return home, turning air superiority into a presence that never seemed to leave. As more P-51 Mustangs arrived to take over the longest-range escort duties in spring 1944, P-47 units increasingly shifted toward ground attack, a role that would make them the most feared aircraft in the German arsenal by those who survived to remember them. The transition began in earnest in April 1944 as the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, and the Thunderbolt's heavy machine gun battery proved equally effective against targets on the ground. Armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could penetrate the top armor of most German vehicles, and the sheer volume of fire could destroy soft targets in seconds. A 2-second burst delivered roughly 160 half-inch projectiles into a target area the size of a truck, turning movement into fire and metal. But it was the addition of bombs and rockets that transformed the P-47 into something beyond a fighter, because the D-25 variant could carry two 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pounder under the fuselage, a load equal to early war medium bombers, now delivered by a single-seat aircraft that could also fight its way to the target and back. Later variants added zero-length rocket stubs for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell in destructive effect, turning the Thunderbolt into flying artillery with the accuracy of aimed fire. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, experienced P-47 ground attacks firsthand and never forgot the details. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces behind the glass, and the sound was layered. First the engine roar, then the rocket scream, then the hammering percussion of 8 heavy machine guns firing together, and a column of 20 trucks simply ceased to exist, transformed into burning wreckage in one pass, as if von Luck described the psychological effect on his men as devastating, because they had faced artillery and air attack before. But this felt different, more personal, as if each aircraft carried a specific intention to find you and end you. And the accuracy made it seem like the pilots could see inside your head and know where you would run before you ran there. On June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe discovered how completely the balance of power had shifted when over 500 P-47s provided air cover for the invasion, creating an umbrella over the beaches that German fighters could not penetrate without being massacred in numbers that made the attempt pointless. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of JG-2, one of only 3 German pilots to reach the beach area that day, reported that the sky belonged to the Americans in a way that made flight itself feel like trespassing. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet, layered in altitude bands with overlapping coverage, and every attempt to break through met another formation waiting at exactly the wrong place. Fischer's Gruppe launched 12 fighters at dawn. He returned alone, the only survivor of an encounter that lasted minutes, and felt like being fed into a machine designed to convert aircraft into aluminum rain.
In the weeks following D-Day, P-47s systematically strangled German movement in daylight, and the statistics became staggering. In June alone, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts claimed 651 locomotives destroyed, 3,147 trucks wrecked, 512 tanks and armored vehicles eliminated, and 4,153 horse-drawn vehicles turned into wreckage, forcing the Wehrmacht to move only at night and severely hampering their ability to respond to Allied advances because logistics operated at half speed when conducted in.
The Germans tried everything to counter the Thunderbolt threat, reinforced vehicle armor, deployed more anti-aircraft guns, developed new camouflage techniques, dispersed movement patterns. Yet nothing worked, because the P-47's combination of speed, armor, and firepower made it nearly unstoppable once committed to an attack, and even the feared 80mm flak guns struggled to track fast-moving fighters at low altitude, where engagement windows measured in seconds, and a miss by a fraction meant while devastating Europe, the P-47 was simultaneously proving its worth in the Pacific Theater, where the 348th Fighter Group operating from New Guinea discovered that the Thunderbolt's qualities, durability, firepower, range, were perfectly suited to the vast distances and harsh environmental conditions of island warfare. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th, developed tactics specifically adapted to Pacific conditions, and on October 11, 1943, he led 4 P-47s against approximately 40 Japanese aircraft over WWII, personally shooting down 6 enemy planes in a single mission and earning the Medal of Honor for an action that demonstrated the same clumsy airplane could dominate in 2 very different wars being fought simultaneously on opposite sides of the globe. The Japanese, accustomed to fighting nimble but fragile American fighters, were unprepared for the P-47's combination of hitting power and damage resistance. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who encountered thunderbolts over New Guinea, later wrote that they called them monsters because 20mm cannon fire that could destroy a P-40 with a few hits seemed to have no effect, and he described putting dozens of rounds into one thunderbolt and watching it fly away as if nothing had happened, while the return fire was terrifying. Streams of heavy bullets that tore aircraft into fragments so small they didn't look like they had ever been machines. The P-47N, developed specifically for Pacific operations, featured increased fuel capacity with wet wings holding 93 gallons each, extending range to 2,350 miles and proving that the supposedly short-legged fighter of 1943 had evolved into a true long-range weapon capable of escorting B-29 superfortresses toward Japan. Perhaps the ultimate vindication of the P-47's evolution came in its encounters with German jet fighters. Because the Messerschmitt Me-262, with its 540-mile-per-hour top speed, should have been untouchable by propeller-driven aircraft. Yet Thunderbolt pilots discovered they could catch jets in two specific windows: during takeoff and landing, when jets were most vulnerable and slowest, and in high-speed dives from altitude where the P-47 could temporarily become a falling projectile fast enough to close distance before the jet pilot recognized the threat. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the first pilots to shoot down a Me-262 with a P-47, diving from 28,000 feet and reaching speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, fast enough to catch the jet in level flight before it could accelerate away. And Meyer's combat report noted that the enemy aircraft disintegrated under fire, large pieces including both engines separating from the fuselage, the pilot failing to escape, and the concentrated fire of 850 caliber guns proving more effective against jet aircraft than anticipated, because jets were fast but fragile, built for speed rather than structural resilience. By early 1945, specialized P-47M variants were deployed specifically to counter German jets and V-1 flying bombs, with water methanol injection boosting power output to 2,800 horsepower and refined aerodynamics, allowing these ultimate thunderbolts to reach 470 miles per hour in level flight at 30,000 feet, fast enough to intercept even jets under certain tactical conditions. Major George Bostwick, commanding the 63rd Fighter Squadron equipped with P-47Ms, shot down two Me-262s in March 1945, and his tactical report emphasized firepower over speed, noting that jets were faster but couldn't turn effectively and couldn't absorb punishment. One solid burst from 8 Brownings, and they came apart as if made from paper, and the key was catching them when they had to slow down to attack bombers. Exactly the moment when propeller fighters could finally close the distance. The ultimate demonstration of American industrial might came during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate attempt to destroy Allied air power on the ground through a massive surprise attack on January 1, 1945, when nearly 900 German fighters, including many of their best remaining pilots and instructors, launched coordinated strikes on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands, in a final gamble to regain air superiority through sheer audacity. At Y-34 Airfield near Metz, home to the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, the attack initially succeeded, with German fighters destroying 22 Thunderbolts on the ground along with several other aircraft, and a captured German pilot brought to the command post pointed at the burning wreckage and taunted the Americans, asking what they thought of that. Major George Brookings' response became legendary throughout the 9th Air Force because it cut straight to the asymmetry that would decide the war. He pointed to the flight line where ground crews were already pushing damaged aircraft aside and preparing hard stands for replacements. And he said by tomorrow they would have 40 new aircraft flown in from depots in England, then asked how long it would take Germany to replace the pilots they had just lost. Because pilots were the irreplaceable, the Germans' expression changed as the mathematics became clear. Within 48 hours, factory-fresh P-47D-40s filled the flight line exactly as promised, while the Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots in Bodenplatte, including many irreplaceable instructors and squadron leaders whose experience could never be recreated through training, because there was no longer time or fuel or safe airspace to train replacements properly. These losses Germany could never replace, while the Americans lost 134 aircraft total across all attacked airfields and replaced them within a week, as if destruction were merely a temporary inventory problem. The numbers themselves told the story of inevitable defeat. Republic Aviation produced 15,683 P-47s during the war, more than any other American fighter type, and at peak production, the Farmingdale factory on Long Island was completing one Thunderbolt approximately every hour around the clock, while the Evansville plant in Indiana, built from empty farmland in 1942, was producing roughly 500 aircraft per month by 1944, and each P-47D required 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber, with the engine alone containing 2,400 individual components, machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Yet American workers, many of them women who had never seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these complex machines with precision that sometimes exceeded peacetime manufacturing standards, because the system had been designed for exactly this kind of mass production. Ammunition production was equally staggering. Each P-47 sortie required 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, and with hundreds of Thunderbolts flying daily missions, consumption exceeded 10 million rounds per month by mid-1944, requiring plants like Lake City Arsenal in Missouri to produce 30 million rounds monthly, each cartridge manufactured to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch to ensure reliable feeding through synchronized gun mechanisms, even at high altitude in now. Cold air under vibration with a pilot's life depending on the next belt link advancing correctly. Fuel consumption was enormous. Each Thunderbolt burned roughly 100 gallons per hour in normal cruise, up to 300 gallons per hour in combat with water injection engaged, and the 9th Air Force alone consumed over 25 million gallons of aviation fuel monthly by late 1944, all of it shipped across the Atlantic in tankers that were themselves products of American mass production, creating a logistics chain designed to keep moving regardless of losses. Even more impressive than aircraft production was pilot training, because by 1944, the United States was graduating approximately 30,000 pilots annually from advanced training programs, more than Germany had trained during the entire war, and each P-47 pilot received a minimum of 400 hours of flight training before entering combat, including roughly 100 hours in advanced fighters, while German pilots, by contrast, were entering combat with less than 100 hours total. Time by war's end, sometimes far less, and the quality difference showed in everything: formation discipline, navigation in weather, gunnery accuracy, and the ability to think clearly while the cockpit shook and the radio screamed and someone was trying to kill you. American pilots arrived in Europe trained in formation flying, instrument navigation, deflection gunnery, and energy management tactics. They had practiced against captured German aircraft, studying their enemies' capabilities and limitations in controlled conditions. They knew their aircraft systems intimately, having studied technical manuals that German pilots never received because documentation was considered less important than combat experience. Yet combat experience could no longer be accumulated safely when the skies were full of enemies and fuel was rationed and instructors were dead. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, arriving in England in September 1944, exemplified the American training advantage. He had 420 hours in his logbook, including 75 hours in the P-47. He had fired at towed targets, practiced deflection shooting until the geometry became instinct, studied gun camera film from actual combat to understand what worked and what killed people. When he flew his first mission, he knew exactly what to do because he had rehearsed it dozens of times in conditions where mistakes meant demerits rather than death. And he later summarized the disparity by noting that the German pilot he faced couldn't have had half his experience, and the encounter didn't feel like a fair fight so much as an execution of someone who had been sent to die without adequate preparation. In March 1945, Oberleutnant Josef Priller, the same pilot who had mocked P-47s as pregnant cows 2 years earlier, was interviewed by German propaganda officials seeking material to boost morale, and his statement was deemed too demoralizing for publication because it admitted the truth too openly. The Thunderbolt, he said, had become the best fighter bomber ever built, its firepower unprecedented, its weapons systems reliable in ways German equipment no longer was, never jamming, never overheating, never running out of ammunition in normal combat because the belts were so long and the supply chain so robust. He described how it carried bombs like a medium bomber, fired rockets like artillery, and still fought like a fighter when necessary. But beyond the machine itself was what it represented. Unlimited American production, a system where they could lose 10 and build 20, while Germany lost 1 and it was gone forever, where their pilots arrived better trained than German instructors, where they had fuel for training and ammunition for practice and spare parts for everything, while Germany had nothing left but courage, and courage without resources was just delayed defeat. Priller ended by noting they had laughed in 1943, and they were not laughing anymore, because when you heard those guns, you knew death had arrived, and the sound haunted survivors. Mechanical, precise, unstoppable, like everything American, built around overwhelming material superiority rather than individual skill. And they hadn't been beaten through better tactics or braver pilots, but buried under an avalanche of steel and fire until resistance became mathematically impossible. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. Airfields were cratered ruins that could not support sustained operations even if planes had been available. And even with aircraft and fuel, German pilots faced an impossible tactical equation, because attacking meant flying into P-47 formations that owned every altitude band from ground level to 40,000 feet, closing every escape route and turning the sky into a